There is a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a name in most conversations. It isn't the sharp sting of outright rejection. It isn't the hollow ache of being forgotten entirely. It's something more precise than that, something that lives in a very particular space between being seen and being chosen. It's the experience of being someone's second thought. The person who gets the call after the first call goes unanswered. The friend who gets invited when someone else cancels. The partner someone settles into after the one they really wanted didn't work out. The child who always sensed, even without words, that someone else in the room held a different place in the hearts of the people who were supposed to love you equally. You weren't invisible. That's what makes this so hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. You were there. You were noticed. People knew your name, knew your face, knew you were present. But when the moment came to choose, when the moment came to prioritize, when the moment came to reach out first, to call first, to pick first, your name arrived second, or third, or only when the preferred option fell through. And here's what psychology tells us about that experience. It doesn't just hurt in the moment. It teaches you something. It teaches your nervous system, your attachment patterns, your relational instincts, your inner narrative about your own worth. It rewires something fundamental about how you move through the world, how you read people, how you trust love, how you interpret silence, how you decide what you deserve. And most of the time, you carry all of that rewiring without ever understanding where it came from or why it feels so heavy. This is what we're going to explore today. Not to reopen wounds for the sake of pain, but because understanding is the beginning of something. Because giving language to an experience that has lived in you without words is itself a form of healing. Because you deserve to finally understand why you are the way you are, not as a flaw to correct, but as a deeply intelligent response to something genuinely difficult. So let's begin at the beginning. Let's begin with what it actually means to be the second option, and why the human brain responds to that experience in ways that last far longer than the moments that created them. When psychologists study social rejection, they tend to focus on the dramatic versions. Being excluded from a group, being publicly humiliated, being told directly that you are not wanted. And those experiences are genuinely painful. Research consistently shows that social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The brain processes being left out the same way it processes being hurt. That's not metaphor. That's neurological reality. But there is a subtler form of social exclusion that receives far less attention, and in many ways, it may be more psychologically complex precisely because of its ambiguity. Being the second option isn't outright rejection. You're included. You're wanted. Just not first. And that ambiguity is where so much of the psychological damage lives, because your mind cannot file it cleanly. You can't say, "I was rejected," and process it. You have to hold something much more complicated. I was chosen, but only after someone else said no. I am wanted, but not wanted most. I matter, but I don't matter most. And the mind, particularly the developing mind of a child or the vulnerable mind of someone in an important relationship, doesn't know what to do with that. It can't reject the relationship entirely because the relationship contains real warmth. But it can't fully trust the relationship either because the warmth is conditional, ranked, distributed according to a hierarchy that places you somewhere in the middle. So what does the mind do? It adapts. It becomes extraordinarily, sometimes exhaustingly, alert. There is a concept in psychology called rejection sensitivity, and it describes something that researchers have documented across decades of study. When a person experiences repeated social rejection or repeated experiences of being deprioritized, the brain begins to recalibrate. It begins to scan the environment with increased vigilance for signs that rejection is coming again. Not because the person is paranoid, not because they're insecure in some shallow, fixable way, but because the brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's learning from experience. It's building a predictive model. It's saying, the last time I didn't notice the signs early enough, it hurt. So let me notice earlier next time. If this is resonating with you, if you're recognizing something in yourself as we go, I'd love it if you'd like the video and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. If you grew up as the second option, or if you've spent significant time in relationships where you were consistently deprioritized, you likely developed a kind of social perception that most people simply don't have. You became fluent in a language that most people never learn to read. The language of tone shifts, the language of pauses that last a half second too long, the language of enthusiasm that sounds slightly different when it's directed at someone else in the room, the language of being included in plans that feel like afterthoughts, the language of warmth that's real but somehow rationed. You learn to read people not because you're suspicious or neurotic, but because your brain understood early that being caught off guard was painful and that the signs were always there if you knew how to look. You became, without choosing to, an expert in the subtle architecture of human preference. And here's what makes this so difficult to understand from the outside. This heightened perception is often invisible to the people around you. They don't see the work happening inside you. They don't see the constant low-level processing, the reading of rooms, the interpreting of messages, the noticing of who got called first and who got called second. They just see someone who is perceptive or intuitive, or sometimes someone who seems a little too sensitive, a little too aware, a little too easily hurt by things that seem small. But they're not small. They never were. They were data points in a pattern your brain has been tracking for years. And the exhausting part, the part that rarely gets acknowledged, is that this hypervigilance doesn't turn off when the threat is gone. It doesn't turn off when you enter a new relationship or a new friendship or a new job, because it's no longer a conscious strategy. It became a default mode. It became the way you exist in social space. Always reading, always interpreting, always asking the quiet question that you'd never say aloud. Am I still the first choice, or has something shifted? This is valid. This is real. And it is not a character flaw. It is a deeply intelligent adaptation to an environment that taught you that preference can be withdrawn without warning, and that the warning signs are always quieter than you think. Now, let's talk about what happens to trust when you've spent years as someone's backup plan. One of the most consistent findings in developmental psychology is this: when emotional support is inconsistent, when care is real but unreliable, when love exists but feels ranked, the developing self learns something fundamental about the nature of connection. It learns that depending on others is a risk with a poor return rate. It learns that waiting for someone to show up is often a setup for disappointment. It learns that the safest strategy, the strategy with the highest probability of not getting hurt, is to need less, to expect less, to build an interior world that doesn't require external validation to remain stable. Psychologists sometimes call this compulsive self-reliance. It's a pattern that shows up in people who grew up in environments where emotional availability was inconsistent, where the people they needed most were sometimes present and sometimes absent, sometimes warm and sometimes distant, sometimes choosing them and sometimes choosing someone else. And the pattern looks like strength from the outside. It often is strength in a very real sense, but it's a strength that came at a cost. If you recognize this in yourself, you know what it feels like. You know the strange experience of being in a moment that should feel vulnerable, a moment where reaching out would be natural, and instead feeling a kind of internal closing. A quiet voice that says, "You can handle this yourself. You don't need to ask. You don't need to wait and see if they'll show up. You already know how to get through this alone. You don't hate help." That's important to say. You don't resent people who offer support, but you don't quite trust it either. Because somewhere in your history, support was something that came and went according to a logic you couldn't control. It was available when you were convenient, and it was redirected when someone more preferred needed it. So you stopped building your foundations on it. You stopped letting your emotional architecture depend on something that had proven itself unreliable. And this is where the psychology gets genuinely complex. Because this self-reliance, this capacity to move through pain alone, to solve problems without needing to be rescued, to celebrate quietly without requiring an audience, this is a genuine form of resilience. Research on people who have experienced chronic social exclusion consistently shows elevated emotional endurance. The capacity to tolerate disappointment without catastrophizing. The capacity to stay regulated when plans fall apart. The capacity to survive the departure of people who were supposed to stay. You've seen people leave before. You felt the quiet shift from being someone's priority to being their afterthought. And you survived it, not because it didn't hurt, but because you had already, somewhere along the way, prepared yourself for the possibility that it might happen again. But here's the invisible truth that lives inside that resilience. The preparation is also a kind of grief. The not expecting is also a kind of loss. When you stop waiting for people to choose you first, you protect yourself, yes, but you also, quietly, stop believing that being chosen first is something that happens to people like you. You start to experience it as a category you don't belong to, not consciously, not in a way you'd ever say aloud, but in the way you respond when someone does choose you first. When someone does prioritize you, when someone does reach out before they've tried anyone else, there's a part of you that doesn't quite know what to do with that. There's a part of you that waits for the correction, for the moment when the real first choice becomes available and you slide back to your familiar position. And that waiting, that bracing, is exhausting in a way that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. I want to pause here and ask you something. When did you first realize this was a pattern in your life? Was there a specific moment, a relationship, a friendship, a family dynamic where it clicked? Drop it in the comments if you're willing. You don't have to share details, even just a word or two, because someone else is reading those comments looking for proof that they're not alone in this. Let's talk about what this does to the way you love people. Attachment psychology, the field that studies how our earliest relational experiences shape the way we connect with others throughout our lives, has documented something that will likely feel uncomfortably familiar. When a person grows up feeling replaceable, when they internalize the experience of being the second option as something close to a personal truth about their value, they often respond in relationships in a very specific way. They give more than they receive, not a little more, often significantly more. More time, more energy, more patience, more understanding, more forgiveness, more effort to be the kind of person who cannot be replaced, who cannot be downgraded, who cannot be quietly swapped for a preferred alternative. And here's what's important to understand about this pattern. It doesn't come from weakness. It doesn't come from desperation in any simple sense. It comes from a learned belief about the nature of love, a belief that was shaped by real experience. The belief that love is conditional, that belonging is something you earn and maintain through consistent performance. That if you stop giving, if you stop being useful and understanding and available and accommodating, you will slide back to second place. Psychologists sometimes describe this as anxious attachment, but that label can feel reductive because what's really happening is more specific than anxiety. It's a relational strategy built on a very particular fear. Not the fear of being alone, not the fear of conflict, but the fear of being temporarily accepted and then quietly replaced. The fear of being someone's placeholder. And so you give. You give generously, and you give consistently, and you give even when you're tired, and even when you're not receiving the same in return. Because somewhere in the logic your nervous system constructed, giving is the thing that keeps you from sliding back to the position you've spent your whole life trying to escape. This is where it gets complicated, because this giving is real. It's genuine. It comes from a real capacity for care and empathy and investment in the people you love. But it's also, underneath, a form of protection. And the problem with protection strategies that look like love is that they're very hard to examine honestly. Because to examine them honestly, you have to ask a question that feels dangerous. Am I giving this much because I love them, or because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? And the answer, for most people who have lived as the second option, is probably both. And that's okay. That doesn't make the love less real, but it does mean that the giving has a shadow side. A side that quietly depletes you. A side that makes you vulnerable to people who will accept your generosity without ever truly reciprocating it. A side that can keep you in relationships that don't actually see you because the alternative, the risk of giving less and being replaced, feels worse. You deserve to understand this pattern. Not so you can stop giving, because your capacity to give is genuinely beautiful, but so you can begin to recognize when you're giving from love and when you're giving from fear. Because those two things feel similar from the inside, but they lead to very different places. There is something else that lives inside the psychology of people who were always the second option. Something that rarely gets named, but that shapes so much of the inner life. It's a very specific fear, not the fear of being left, not the fear of loneliness in the conventional sense, but the fear of being temporary. People who have been consistently deprioritized often develop what psychologists describe as a core belief about their own replaceability. It's not always conscious. It doesn't always announce itself as a belief. It shows up instead in behavior, in the way you downplay your own needs so as not to seem like too much, in the way you avoid conflict because conflict might tip the scales towards someone more agreeable, in the way you accept treatment that doesn't fully honor you because the alternative, asserting what you deserve and risking the relationship, feels more dangerous than the quiet diminishment of accepting less. You don't fear loneliness the way some people do. You've already learned to be alone. You've already built a life that can function without consistent external support. What you fear is something more specific and more painful. You fear being in a relationship, a friendship, a family, a workplace, and still being the one who gets quietly deprioritized. You fear being present and still being second, because that's the experience that shaped you. Not absence, presence without priority. Research in interpersonal psychology consistently shows that chronic experiences of being deprioritized, particularly in early relationships, create a template, a relational template that the mind uses to interpret new relationships, to predict how they will unfold, to decide what level of investment is safe to make. And when that template is built on the experience of being replaceable, it creates a very specific kind of relational stance, one that is simultaneously deeply invested and quietly held back, one that gives generously while keeping a small, private reserve of hope that doesn't fully commit. Because full commitment has historically meant full exposure to being replaced. And here's the truth most people miss. This isn't self-sabotage in any simple sense. It's not an irrational fear. It's a learned prediction based on real data. Your nervous system isn't malfunctioning. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting you based on everything it has learned about how relationships work for someone like you. The question isn't, why do I do this? The question is, what would it mean to update the prediction? What would it mean to hold the possibility that the template, as accurate as it once was, might not be the final truth about every relationship you will ever have? What shifted something for you? Was there a moment, a conversation, a realization that started to loosen the grip of this pattern? I'd genuinely love to know. Share it in the comments if you feel comfortable, because that kind of insight has a way of reaching exactly the person who needs to hear it. Let's talk about loyalty, because people who have been the second option often develop a relationship with loyalty that is unlike anything most people understand. When affection feels unstable, when warmth is real but ranked, when belonging feels conditional, the mind begins to search for something more reliable than feeling, something more consistent than enthusiasm, something more trustworthy than being someone's favorite. And what it finds, what it latches onto with a kind of fierce and quiet conviction, is consistency. Not the excitement of being chosen in a grand gesture, not the intensity of being someone's obsession, but the simple, profound, almost radical experience of being chosen again and again and again, of being someone's reliable presence, of being the person they come back to, not because you're the most exciting option, but because you are the one they genuinely want. This is what psychologists mean when they describe a shift from anxious to secure attachment. Not the absence of care, but the presence of consistency. And people who have spent their lives as the second option often have an unusually clear understanding of what consistency actually means, because they have spent years in its absence. You don't chase excitement, not because you're incapable of it, but because you've learned something about the difference between intensity and reliability. You've learned that someone who is intensely enthusiastic about you today can quietly redirect that enthusiasm tomorrow. You've learned that being someone's favorite feeling is not the same as being someone's genuine commitment. You've learned, through real experience, that the most meaningful thing another person can offer you is not the height of their feeling, but the steadiness of their presence. And so you value loyalty the way someone who has been cold values warmth. Not abstractly, not theoretically, but with a bone-deep understanding of what it means to have it and what it costs to lose it. If you find someone who chooses you consistently, who doesn't rank you against other options, who reaches for you first without calculating whether someone better might be available, you recognize it. You feel it in a way that people who have always been first choices might not fully understand. Because you know what the alternative feels like. You know the weight of being second, and the experience of being first, genuinely first, not by default, but by choice, lands differently for you. It means something different. It matters in a way that goes all the way down. And here is where the psychology opens into something important. Something that feels, maybe for the first time, like solid ground. The experience of being the second option, as painful and as shaping as it has been, gave you something. It gave you a clarity about what actually matters in human connection that people who have never had to question their worth in a relationship often lack. It gave you the ability to see through performance and into substance. It gave you a sensitivity to the difference between being included and being valued, between being tolerated and being genuinely wanted. It gave you an understanding of loyalty that is not naive but earned, an understanding of love that is not romantic in the shallow sense but real in the deepest sense. It also gave you a resilience that is not the brittle kind, not the resilience that refuses to feel, but the resilience that has felt deeply and repeatedly and has continued anyway. The resilience that knows how to survive disappointment without letting it become the whole story. The resilience that can hold pain without being consumed by it. Research on post-traumatic growth, the documented phenomenon of genuine psychological development following difficult experiences, consistently shows that people who have navigated chronic interpersonal difficulty often develop elevated empathy, deeper relational wisdom, and a more authentic sense of what they value. Not because suffering is good, it isn't, but because the mind that has had to work hard to understand its own experience often develops a depth that easier circumstances don't produce. You developed that depth. You may not have chosen it. You may wish, in quiet moments, that you could trade some of that depth for the simpler experience of having always felt like someone's first choice. That's a valid wish. It makes complete sense. But the depth is real. The wisdom is real. The capacity for genuine connection that lives inside someone who has had to question whether they deserve it, and arrived at the answer, yes, that capacity is extraordinary. And here's the truth most people miss about people who were always the second option. They don't just survive their relational history. They often become the most genuinely present people in any room, because they know what it feels like to be overlooked, because they have lived in the experience of being present but not prioritized. They often become the people who notice the person on the edges, who reach out to the one who seems fine but isn't, who remember the details that signal to someone else that they were truly seen. They become, in other words, the first choice for the people who need what they have learned to give. Not because they're performing goodness, not because they're trying to earn their place, but because they understand, in a way that is cellular and real, what it means to be seen. And they refuse to let other people feel what they felt. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, something profound. Now, none of this means the pain was worth it in some tidy narrative sense. None of this means you should be grateful for having been deprioritized. You shouldn't. You deserve to be chosen first. You deserve to be someone's first call, first thought, first choice. If you weren't, that is a real loss, and it deserves to be acknowledged as such, not reframed away, not spiritualized into a lesson before it's been fully grieved. So let's stay here for a moment. Let's say clearly what rarely gets said. Being the second option hurt. It hurt in the quiet moments when you noticed the preference being given to someone else. It hurt in the moments when you were included but could feel that your inclusion was a consolation. It hurt in the relationships where you gave everything and received warmth that was real but still somehow rationed. It hurt in the moments when you looked at someone who seemed to be everyone's first choice and wondered quietly what they had that you didn't, what you were missing, what you had done wrong. You hadn't done anything wrong. That needs to be said plainly and without qualification. The experience of being the second option is not a verdict on your worth. It is not evidence that you are less lovable, less interesting, less valuable than the people who were chosen first. It is evidence of something about the environment you were in. The people who were doing the choosing, the dynamics and histories and limitations that shaped their preferences in ways that had nothing to do with your actual value. But knowing that intellectually and feeling it are two different things. And if you've spent years absorbing the implicit message that you are the backup, the alternative, the acceptable substitute, then knowing intellectually that you deserved better doesn't automatically dissolve the internal architecture that was built around that experience. The hypervigilance doesn't disappear because you understand its origins. The compulsive self-reliance doesn't dissolve because you can name it. The fear of being temporary doesn't vanish because you've read about attachment theory. What understanding does, what giving language to these patterns actually accomplishes, is something more gradual and more real than a sudden transformation. It begins to create a small but significant space between the pattern and the identity, between what your nervous system learned and what you actually are, between the prediction your brain makes about how relationships work and the actual possibility that exists in front of you. When you understand why you read social signals so intensely, you can begin to ask whether the reading is accurate or whether it's the pattern running on old data. When you understand why you give more than you receive, you can begin to notice the moments when you're giving from love and the moments when you're giving from fear, and you can begin slowly and with enormous self-compassion to make different choices. When you understand why consistency matters to you more than intensity, you can stop apologizing for wanting what you want and start recognizing it as wisdom. This is what psychology offers. Not a cure, not a rewrite of your history, but a map, a way of understanding the terrain you've been navigating so that the navigation becomes less exhausting, more conscious, more aligned with what you actually deserve. And what you deserve is this: to be someone's first thought, to be reached out to before the preferred option becomes unavailable, to be in relationships where your presence is not a consolation but a genuine desire, to give generously from a place of love rather than from a place of fear, to trust that your worth is not contingent on being useful or available or accommodating, to exist in connection without constantly bracing for the moment you slide back to second place. That is not too much to ask. That is the baseline of what human connection is supposed to feel like. And the fact that it has felt like too much to hope for, the fact that you have normalized being second because being second was safer than hoping for first, that is the wound that deserves the most tender attention. You are not broken because you adapted to being the second option. You are not damaged beyond repair because you built a self that could survive that experience. You are not doomed to repeat the relational patterns that were shaped by that history. You are someone who navigated genuinely difficult terrain without a map, and you did it with more grace and more resilience than you have ever given yourself credit for. The hypervigilance is not a flaw. It is a gift that was purchased at too high a price, and you are allowed to set it down sometimes. The self-reliance is not a wall. It is a foundation that was built in difficult circumstances, and you are allowed to let people in now, carefully and on your own terms. The overgiving is not weakness. It is love that learned the wrong lesson about what makes it safe, and you are allowed to give from a different place now. The fear of being temporary is not paranoia. It is a wound that deserves to be seen, and you are allowed to heal it. You are allowed to be someone's first choice. You are allowed to expect it. You are allowed to walk away from relationships that consistently place you second, and toward relationships that reach for you first without calculating who else might be available. You are allowed to trust love that is consistent. You are allowed to receive without immediately asking what it will cost you. You are allowed to stop performing for your place in someone's life and simply occupy it fully and without apology. Once you understand the pattern, you stop blaming yourself for it. Once you stop blaming yourself for it, you can begin to change it. Not overnight, not without difficulty, but genuinely, and in the direction of something that feels, for the first time, like being truly chosen. If someone in your life is carrying this quietly, someone who always seems to give more than they receive, who deflects care, who seems fine, but you suspect has spent a long time feeling like the backup option, consider sharing this with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for another person is hand them the language for something they've never been able to say out loud. That single act of sharing can make someone feel less alone in an experience they thought was invisible. If this video helped you feel seen, if something in these words gave language to an experience you've been carrying without a name, then I hope you'll stay. There's more here, more explorations of the invisible patterns that shape us, more language for the experiences that go unspoken, more permission to understand yourself as someone navigating difficult terrain rather than someone fundamentally broken. And if you feel safe, share something in the comments, even something small, because someone else is watching this right now, carrying the same quiet history, wondering if anyone else has ever felt exactly what they feel. Your voice, even a few words of it, might be the thing that makes them feel a little less alone in it. Thank you for watching. And if this exploration of hidden psychological patterns resonated with you, the video on the psychology of people who can never pick just one thing goes deep into another invisible pattern that shapes identity and relationships in ways most people never connect to their history. It's worth watching.